So my name is Misha and I'm joined today by Karen. I'm the Director of Assurance here and Karen is our Technical Director. She's really the brains behind sustainability assurance matters, so I'm going to let her do a lot of the heavy lifting today. Thank you, Karen. What are we going to cover? We are going to briefly walk you through our consultation document, which covers a range of different matters. And then I'm going to hand over to Karen, who's going to do the deep dive into one of the exposure drafts today, which is on 5,000. And then she'll talk through some of the proposed New Zealand amendments and remind you about how you can provide your views on our consultation. So, in July, we issued a consultation document which explores international alignment. The XRB is seeking your views on whether we should make available for use a recent package of 3 international standards, in particular for sustainability assurance engagements, and we are seeking those views by the 10th of October. It's quite a big package of information. There are 3 new international standards. The first is the Engagement Performance Standard 5,000, which is the general requirements for sustainability assurance engagements. The second is the ethics and independence requirements for sustainability assurance engagements. And the third is using the work of an external expert. That third one applies to both financial statement audits as well as sustainability assurance engagements. These 3 standards internationally will work as a package, and their application date is for periods on or after December 2026. So we are seeking your views really early to try to give you enough time to understand what's in this package and then consider whether or not you wish to apply these standards or not. How can these standards be used in the New Zealand context? So the package of 5,000, the ethics and independence standards and the work of an external expert as relevant to an assurance engagement for sustainability, they can be applied as an option for mandatory GHG emissions. So for our climate reporting entities, they have to have their GHG emissions assured. So that package is an option for them. But it could also be used much more broadly, and that's for voluntary assurance on other information in the climate statements, as well as on voluntarily reported sustainability information or voluntarily assured sustainability information. The second part where these standards may be required to be used if we adopt them is for the relying on the work of an external expert. Our proposal there is that it would be mandatory for use for financial statement audits and reviews. Now let's think about what will this impact be for our mandatory assurance over GHG disclosures for our climate reporting entities in New Zealand. We will retain our current temporary standard NZSAE1. That's our mandatory assurance standard which applies for this regime. We currently require the use of one of 2 international standards. That's 3410 or the ISSA. We now have the potential for a new international standard, 5,000. So what we're proposing to do is to add 5,000 as one of a third option. So you can choose as to whether you use 5,000, 3410 or the ISO for our mandatory regime. And that will be aligned with the effective date of 15 December 2026. So what we are proposing is that it's not mandatory to use 5,000 for this regime, but we are including it as one option, making it available for use. We are going to continue to actively monitor the market to understand and make decisions around the future of this temporary standard. But this approach that we are proposing allows us time to monitor how other jurisdictions are adopting 5,000 and whether the diverse range of assurance practitioners will engage with and make use of this package of standards. The other question you might have is, well, what does this mean for XRB standards 3410? 3410 is our standard which is very specific to greenhouse gas emissions. Internationally, 5000 is going to replace 3410 in its entirety. This is because greenhouse gas emissions is a type of sustainability information, and so it falls within the scope of ISSA 5000. So internationally, 3410 will no longer be maintained, and assurance practitioners who want to assert compliance with international standards will not be able to refer to 3410. However, for our local context, the XRB has not yet decided whether we should withdraw 3410 locally. This is because of its relevance for our mandatory assurance regime. 5000 has a much broader scope. It covers all sorts of sustainability information, but our local context is mandatory assurance is only required over greenhouse gas emissions. So we want to make sure that there are options available. So going forward, like I've tried to summarize here, and I hope it's clear, the proposal is that you will be able to make a choice between 5000, 3410, or ISO. That's our proposal for now. So what are we monitoring internationally? Well, there is a lot of moving parts in this space, both in the reporting and on the assurance side. We've given you a snapshot of some of those changes here, or developments here. Of most relevance is our neighbours across the ditch in Australia. So Australia is one of the first jurisdictions in the world to adopt and mandatorily apply the 5000 standard. They are applying it effective for periods 1 January 2025. So this is even before the application date of the international standard. This is because Australia has just moved into mandatory climate reporting with an increasing scope of mandatory assurance, and they believe that the 5000 standard is the relevant one for them. Given this decision, we believe it's even more important that we make a version of 5000 available for use in New Zealand so that there is that ability to use a similar standard across trans-Tasman engagements. Other developments which may be of interest. In Canada, they've exposed a version of 5000 but not yet made a decision. That will be in the context of voluntary reporting and voluntary assurance. In the UK, the FRC is also consulted on adopting 5000 on a voluntary basis. Japan is considering mandatory disclosure and assurance. In Europe, the developing omnibus proposals are sort of really changing both the reporting and the assurance landscape in terms of sustainability matters. And very recently, we just heard that Singapore has actually decided a 5-year delay over the reporting and assurance of sustainability information. So that just gives you a flavour for how quickly things are moving and changing, and hopefully gives you a bit of context as to why we are proposing to maintain our temporary standard at this stage. But that's a very, very high-level overview of our consultation document. The purpose of the webinar today is to focus in on 5000. So I'm now going to hand over to Karen to walk you through that. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Misha, and it's my great pleasure to cover some of the key proposals in our exposure draft, ISSA NZ 5000, which is the proposed exposure draft for the International Standard on Sustainability Assurance, General Requirements for Sustainability Assurance Engagements. So today I'm not going to be covering the entire standard. It is a broad standard, but I will be focusing on some key points in the exposure draft, and especially where these proposals may be relevant in the context of our mandatory greenhouse gas reporting and assurance. So first of all, I just want to get a sense of who is in the room with us today, and I will share a poll. The poll has 2 questions. First of all, do you currently perform financial statement audits? And do you currently perform greenhouse gas or sustainability assurance engagements? And I will just launch the poll now if you are able to just pop your answer in. Fantastic. I'll just give a couple more seconds if there are a few more people who want to vote. Right. So we have a mixture. We have some financial statement auditors and we have some greenhouse gas auditors and sustainability assurance providers. So welcome to everyone and thank you. So first of all, I want to talk a bit more about why the international standard was developed by the ISSB. So about 2 to 3 years ago, when this standard was first talked about in the board meetings, there was no international standard for sustainability assurance. And there was, I think it was referred to and still referred to as the alphabet soup of sustainability reporting frameworks, a number of sustainability reporting frameworks, and there was demand being seen from users of those reporting frameworks that they wanted to place the trust and confidence in that information that would come from external assurance. So the ISSB decided to develop a standard and a global baseline, and this standard was developed as an professionally agnostic standard, and that is the one on which our proposals, our exposure draft is based, that we are currently consulting on. So for those of you who are familiar with the XRB suite of standards, you will, and I know a number of from the poll, there are a number of you who are, the format of 5000 will be familiar to you. It is drawn from and it builds on some of the existing standards, including ISAE NZ 3000, which is a standard that a number of you may have been using to do assurance over sustainability information at the moment. We know that it is used within as one of the standards with 3410 to assure greenhouse gas disclosures, as well as ISO 14064. ISAE NZ 3000 will continue, but the proposals in 5000 are to replace ISAE 3000 for sustainability assurance in the future. Other proposals that other information that was built on was the EER guidance. And as Misha has already mentioned, the Greenhouse Gas Assurance Standard 3410. This standard was written in 2011 and the proposals in 5000 expand some of the considerations in this standard. And it also draws from the international standards of auditing where they are relevant. So there are best thinking and best practice has come from the group standard and the fraud standard, for example, in the existing suite. So if I move on to the scope of the proposals in the exposure draft. So the exposure draft is to be applied for attestation engagements. So these are engagements in which a party other than the assurance practitioner is responsible for measuring and evaluating the subject matter against criteria, and the assurance practitioner concludes on that subject matter. It is for assurance engagements over all reported sustainability information, although I do want to highlight that in New Zealand, our temporary domestic standard NZSAE1 applies to the mandatory assurance of greenhouse gas disclosures in the climate statements. It covers limited and reasonable assurance. Reasonable assurance being the assurance usually obtained over financial statements audit, and limited assurance is the minimum required for the the assurance of greenhouse gas disclosures in the climate statements, or also for an interim review of financial statements. There are also some new key principles concepts and definitions within the exposure draft. So the first of these that I wanted to cover was sustainability matters. So sustainability matters are the topics and aspects of topics that are required to be reported. So, for example, if we put that into our own climate reporting regime, the topic would be climate, and the aspects of topics would be the 4 pillars included in the Aotearoa New Zealand Climate Standard 1, being governance, risk management, targets and metrics, and strategy. So the entity would select the sustainability matters to be reported unless they are already provided within the framework, as in NZCS1. And then, for example, if we apply this to greenhouse gas disclosure, the entity would then measure the greenhouse gas emissions against a standard that they have chosen to measure against, and would report the outcome of that measurement as sustainability information and disclosures within the climate-related disclosures. So the sustainability information is information about sustainability matters and is the outcome of the measurement and evaluation against a framework and the information that the entity discloses within their statements that need to be assured. So if we go on to the next slide, underpinning all of the proposals within our exposure draft are quality management principles. So this exposure draft is a standalone standard. It does not require the use of other audit and assurance standards. For example, it does not require use of the international standards on auditing, the ISSAs, or the review engagement standards, but it is underpinned by quality requirements. The requirement in these proposals is that the assurance practitioner apply either professional and ethical standard 3, and this is the New Zealand equivalent of the International Standard on Quality Management 1, ISQM 1, or requirements that are at least as demanding as professional and ethical standard 3. At the XRB, we have determined that professional and ethical standard 3 is at least as demanding as the International Standard on Quality Management. We are not intending to make a determination over other professional and ethical standards that are in place, but the proposals in ISSA 5000 do allow an accreditation body or a recognised regulator or oversight body to make this determination. And we do understand that work is underway internationally to look into these principles and requirements. As with quality management, underpinning all of the requirements are also relevant and ethical requirements, and these include those requirements related to independence. As Misha mentioned earlier, one of the exposure drafts we are consulting on concurrently with this one is the ISSA NZ. And this is a new part to the extant code that covers independence and ethical requirements for sustainability assurance practitioners. This is specified within ISSA within 5000. So 5000 requires a sustainability assurance practitioner to either apply the proposals in the exposure draft, ISSA NZ, or proposals that are at least as demanding as the exposure draft. Again, in line with our normal approach and due process in approving standards in New Zealand, we have determined that our ED that we are consulting is at least as demanding as the international version of the ISSA. And as we have added to the ED for any compelling reason changes, and we have not taken anything away from it. The same requirements apply as the quality management. And although we are not proposing to make a determination of whether other other ethical requirements exist that are at least as demanding as the ISSA, we understand that work is underway again internationally with the International Accreditation Forum to look into this. So one of the requirements of the standard is to assess the risks of material misstatement. And this assessment is at different levels depending on the level of assurance that is sought to be obtained over the disclosures. The assessment for limited assurance is at the disclosure level. The assessment for reasonable assurance is at the assertion level. So the assurance practitioner may consider whether the disclosures for reasonable assurance are complete, whether they are accurate, whether the cutoff of the disclosures is correct, and whether the presentation and classification is accurate. So more procedures would need to be performed at reasonable assurance as opposed to limited assurance. Currently in New Zealand, limited assurance is the level of assurance required, the minimum level of assurance required for the mandatory assurance of the greenhouse gas disclosures in the climate statements. Now if I move to materiality. So the first bullet point on this slide refers to the entity's process to identify sustainability information to be reported. So you may be wondering why I included that in this slide. Often it is referred to in some frameworks as the entity's materiality process. This has been separately identified within 5000 to make sure that the difference between the entity's process and the practitioner's process to determine materiality are different, and it is clear that they two are different. Some sustainability reporting frameworks do require the entity to go through a process of selecting which sustainability matters are material to be reported. They do not specify the matters that should be reported, as in the case of our climate standards. So if this is the case, that is known as the entity's process to identify sustainability information. Then we move on to practitioner's materiality. Materiality is always a judgment, and exposure draft ISSA 5000 requires practitioners to determine materiality for quantitative disclosures. So for example, if we apply that to our mandatory greenhouse gas disclosures assurance, practitioners would be required to determine or calculate materiality for the Scope 1 for the emissions in the disclosures. It also requires practitioners to consider materiality for qualitative disclosures. And the anticipation and expectation is that the qualitative disclosures are numerous within sustainability reporting. It is anticipated there is a lot of information to be provided to users to give them the understanding necessary for the sustainability reports. There is also a requirement that the assurance practitioner takes the entity's materiality into account throughout the engagement and takes into account what the entity has chosen to report and what they identify as material information to report throughout the assurance engagement. So we move on to the next slide. I thought it would be important to highlight the different team, the engagement team, and what sits outside the engagement team for 5,000. So within the engagement team, you have the personnel who work on the assurance engagement, the people in the firm who are actually doing the assurance work at site with the client, and the managers and partners who are reviewing and signing off that work. You also include the practitioner's internal expert. So if there isn't an expert that you are using within your firm, for example, a sustainability consultant or a particular expert in the measurement of greenhouse gas emissions or for scenario analysis, then they would be considered part of your engagement team and would need to follow the requirements for the engagement team. The component practitioner is also included, and this is a practitioner that performs assurance work related to a component for purposes of the sustainability assurance engagement. And this is identified by the lead assurance practitioner being able to be sufficiently and appropriately involved in that work. So this could be individuals from a network firm, or some firm in which the practitioner is able to be sufficiently and appropriately involved. And they are members of the engagement team. Sitting outside the engagement team, but still part of the engagement resources for the sustainability assurance engagement, are the practitioner's external experts. So any experts that practitioner chooses to use from another firm, who are providing expert opinion or expert advice on part of the sustainability assurance engagement. And there are requirements for the capability, competence and objectiveness of the practitioner's external expert, and other requirements that need to be considered. There is also another practitioner, and the difference between this and the component practitioner is that element that I spoke of earlier about the practitioner being able to be sufficiently and appropriately involved in that work. Another practitioner is when the lead practitioner is not able to be sufficiently and appropriately involved in that work, or when the work potentially has been carried out for another purpose. And there are requirements of how to evaluate that work within ISSA 5000, which are important to understand if that is something that you would be planning to do on an assurance engagement. Outside the engagement team, but again, an important part of engagement resources are internal audit. And this is the direct assistance provided by the internal audit function. The next part that I wanted to talk about is groups. So in the middle of this slide is what is probably quite a familiar group structure. Often a reporting boundary or a consolidated reporting boundary would have parent subsidiaries, and the information would be contained within that reporting boundary, with the parent and the subsidiaries having access to the information, and a lot of the information being held at places that the assurance practitioner would be on site at or could obtain the information from. Depending on the reporting boundary selected by the entity that is being subject to sustainability assurance, a sustainability assurance reporting boundary could be wider than the reporting boundary that is the financial statements reporting boundary, or another parent and subsidiary reporting boundary. A group sustainability information assurance engagement may include value chain components, and is quite likely to include value chain components. And these value chain components cover the whole supply chain. They cover your customers, they cover your suppliers. If you manufacture a product, they cover the start of the product through to the end of life emissions from the product. And within our own greenhouse gas disclosures, value chain is included, as the greenhouse gas disclosures include scope 3 emissions disclosures. So to go into value chain in a little bit more detail, the exposure draft ISSA 5000 does not define value chain, because value chain is defined in the reporting framework that the entity uses. But there are a number of principles that are included that are relevant to the value chain. It also introduces a concept of one-to-many reports, and it considers that these one-to-many reports can be important for obtaining information from the value chain. So one-to-many report is a concept that is based on the Service Organization Control Type 2 reports that some of you may already be familiar with for financial statement audits. But it builds on those, and it is not purely over the controls and operating effectiveness of the controls, but it is envisioned that it would include more information to allow many people to rely on assurance reports that are obtained at a value chain entity. There is also application material that is included on value chain, and this has been added for clarification, because it is acknowledged that limitations on access may impact relevance and reliability of audit evidence at the value chain. But the practitioner is required to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence across the value chain information reported by management. So it does not reduce, the limitation on access does not reduce the requirement for the practitioner to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence. But there are some examples in the application material of procedures that may be considered by the practitioner when such limitations exist. And these include potentially testing management's process for obtaining such information, as well as disclosure within the assurance report. And that brings me on to the assurance report. So the basic elements to be included within the assurance report are identified in the standard. That includes identifying the applicable criteria that has been applied by the entity. And entities there, as I said earlier, with the alphabet soup of reporting frameworks, there could be various different applicable criteria that would be identified. There is a requirement for a paragraph on inherent limitation to be included in the assurance report. ISSA 5000 acknowledges the inherent uncertainty with some of this information, and wants to make sure that this is communicated to the user. And this is the opportunity for these inherent uncertainties to be described to the user in the assurance report. The assurance reports are also either limited assurance or reasonable assurance. Limited assurance being expressed in a positive form, whereby that the sustainability information is prepared or fairly presented in all material respects in accordance with the applicable criteria, or limited assurance, which is a negative form, which expresses whether, based on the procedures performed and the evidence obtained, whether a matter has come to the practitioner's attention to cause the practitioner to believe that the sustainability information is not prepared or fairly presented in all material respects in accordance with the applicable criteria. So now I will move on to one question, and just to ask whether you or your firm are intending to transition to ISSA 5000, if you have actually had those discussions and made those choices, and whether you could indicate that on the poll, which I'm just about to share. Thank you. So 86% of you are intending to transition. So I'm hoping that this webinar then is useful as part of some information before, to aid this. So now I'm just going to move on to a few proposed amendments that we have made in New Zealand to the international standard in our exposure draft. And we are looking for comment on these as part of our consultation. So the first amendment that we have made is a proposal to clarify that our temporary domestic standard, NZSAE1, applies to mandatory greenhouse gas assurance engagements. So we acknowledge that the international standards, the scope of it does include greenhouse gas disclosures. So we are proposing this to ensure that for the purposes of those assurance engagements relating to the greenhouse gas emissions required by the Financial Markets Conduct Act to be the subject of an assurance engagement, that those are done under NZSAE1 and that there is a reminder in 5000 to direct assurance practitioners to those requirements. The second amendment that we are proposing is an amendment that we have added to all XRB assurance standards, and this is to address the actual or perceived risks of any conflicts of interest, and it's given the nature of our small market here in New Zealand. So this is a proposal to add a requirement that the assurance practitioner's report includes a statement as to the existence of any relationship that the assurance practitioner has with or any interest that the assurance practitioner has in the entity or any of its subsidiaries. So these are the two amending changes that we are proposing as part of the exposure draft. So last poll, and these are just about the two changes that I just explained just now. So the first one is, do you agree with the proposed changes to clarify the scope? And that's the reference to our domestic temporary standards. And do you agree with the proposed New Zealand changes to 5000 to address the existence of relationships that the assurance practitioner may have? And I will launch that poll now. Thank you. If there is anything that you would like to add on any of those questions, then please feel free to pop down any comments into the chat if there's anything else that you would like to add. And yeah, thank you for your participation there. So moving on, this is the first of our events. So this deep dive is the first of our deep dives. We have another one to cover the other standards, other exposure drafts that Misha talked about earlier. So next week, we have one that covers the ISSA, the independence and ethical requirements. And the following week, we have a deep dive on the exposure draft, which covers the revisions to the code that address using the work of an external expert. And as Misha said earlier, these revisions are both for sustainability assurance practitioners and for financial statement assurance practitioners. And on the 1st of October, we have our panel discussion. We have a very expert panel, members of the ISSB and of the ISSA and an expert practitioner to talk through these proposals in more detail. And we would be delighted if you could join us for any or all of these events. And the links are on the slide, but they are also on our website. And I will now hand back to Misha. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Karen. Heavy lifting there, but I think really valuable insights and hopefully provided some good overview. What I want to sort of talk about very briefly next is potentially some breaking headline news. So this morning, the XRB has launched a consultation proposing very limited amendments to the climate and assurance standards. These are responsive to feedback that we've been hearing in terms of the challenges to both report and have Scope 3 assured. So just like we did last year, we consulted on whether we should extend some adoption provisions. We have just launched today a brief consultation exploring whether we should extend those adoption provisions again. We will be holding a webinar on the 5th of September to explain this to you. And this is a very short consultation. It's just going to be by way of survey. And it closes on the 24th of September. So you may have seen some alerts go out this morning. If you've been too engrossed in this webinar and not checking your inbox, then those alerts might be coming your way. So we do encourage you to participate in that survey and give us your feedback about that view. We do want to make sure that there's two separate consultations and we don't get confused between the two. So our dates sort of are quite different, but we do encourage you to reach out and get in touch on this consultation as well. So that's quite a lot of information to digest. What we wanted to do next is just to allow some time for questions. So if there are any questions, we do encourage you to pop them in the chat and we will do our best to answer those. Whether that's in connection with the general consultation, anything to do with 5,000, or if you have a question about our most breaking headline news. Just see if we've got anything coming through in the chat. Don't see anything, but you do have our contact details there. So if you do have any follow-up questions, please do feel free to reach out and we hopefully will be able to assist. Otherwise, on behalf of the XRB, thank you again for listening and we look forward to hearing your thoughts. Have a great afternoon.